Hello and welcome to Scientists in Action, Cambrian Explosion and Life in an Ocean. I'm Kate, I'm your host, and instead of broadcasting live from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where you might have seen us in the past, we're instead out of state in Boise, Idaho, where we are joining a couple of amazing scientists today to talk about geochronology and some of the cool research that they do here in this incredible facility. A couple housekeeping items I want to go ahead and take care of before we get started. If you're going to be an on-camera group, we're going to ask that you stay muted and off camera until we call you in for Q&A in about 15 or 20 minutes. If you are not on camera and you have questions, love it. We have an open chat for that. So teachers, students, whatever questions you might have throughout the program, you can go ahead and be typing in the chat, and we'll make sure that our scientists get to hear them. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you to Hannah and Thomas. What can you tell us a little bit about maybe yourself, this amazing space that we're in, and I know the whole Cambrian period that we'll be talking about in depth. So take it away.
Yeah, so like Kate mentioned, my name's Hannah. I'm a geologist. I recently got my master's from Utah State University. And there I did a lot of studying of the Cambrian period with particular focus on mapping Cambrian rocks, studying Cambrian fossils. And also I get to come to labs like this and work with awesome scientists like Thomas to answer broad questions and even really specific questions about timing of Earth's history events.
Absolutely, yeah, thanks. Hi, my name is Thomas. I'm a PhD student here at Boise State University. We are now filming live from the Idaho Geology Laboratory. This is one of only a few places in the world we actually get precise and accurate dates on the ages of rocks and minerals in a lab like this. And this is where we take a rock like this right here. This is an ash deposit from a volcano. If we want to figure out how old this is, you come to a place like this to figure that out. What we do is we crush this rock up and we're going to extract out these little, tiny little minerals. Just think of like, you've ever seen like little crystals or something. And it's these little guys that are our clock that we use to date. Instead of a clock in minutes and seconds, this is a clock that we constrain time by looking at the radioactive decay of an element called uranium to an element called lead. It is that ratio of elements that tells us how old it is. So these here are tiny little zircon crystals. Each one of these is probably thinner than your hair on your head, and short little stubby crystals. And we take these guys, we extract them from the rock by crushing it and powdering it and doing all these different fancy techniques to extract out just the zircons. And then we take those into our clean lab we have over here, because we only want to measure the elements that are in these crystals, not the elements that are in contaminants around us. What we'll do is we'll take these little zircon crystals, the ones that we decide to pick, and we come over here to our little clean lab, and we have here, we have this nice little stuff. This is a little sticky mat. So we want to make sure we're not tracking any contaminants, any contaminant lead from our environment. We'll put on rubber gloves, latex gloves, to make sure we're not, contaminating our sample, or the nasty stuff acids and stuff we use in this lab aren't contaminating our hands. Sometimes we'll put on a hairnet, like this guy right here, to make sure we're not shedding any hair follicles in our tail. But there's hundreds of thousands of times more lead in our hair than there is in these zircons we're trying to analyze. And then we'll come in here, we'll put on these little booties to make sure, again, we're not tracking any dirt or contaminants into this very clean space. Then we'll come in here and we'll put on, of course, the mandatory white lab coat that you always see. And we just put this on, and this not only protects us from the samples, the nasty acids we use in there, but also keeps the contaminants like lead that's in our bodies on our shirts from contaminating our samples. And so we'll go in there. We have a lot of fancy tools and procedures that we'll use in there. Sorry. And then what we do is we come and we analyze them on this machine right here. So this is a very fancy, basically you think of it as a very fancy scale. It's called a mass spectrometer. And what we really want to do is weigh the amount of uranium compared to the amount of lead. And so unlike a scale at home where you like to weigh by pounds, we actually want to count the amount of this element. We want to say how much uranium and how much lead. This is a really fancy machine that allows us to do that. And so it allows us to date rocks and minerals from all over the world to try to constrain different events like the evolution of life, the timing of a supervolcanic eruption. So what we're going to talk about today is how we're going to use this element to date the occurrence of fossils that we find throughout the Western United States, and especially in this place called the Grand Canyon, where we get to go and collect these fossils.
Very cool. So just to kind of conceptualize this, it sounds like y'all and other scientists collect these rocks, right? And then you have to break them into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces until it's basically just their atomic, like very basic elemental form. And you look at it with these giant pieces of equipment and you can figure out not only what they're made of, but when they appeared on Earth, correct?
Exactly.
Very cool. So like even that screen I see you have, Hannah. So this is all like in real time, what's happening under that microscope?
Yes, yeah. So what's on the screen here are thousands of little zircon grains, which are also in this dish here. It is kind of the red sandy in the middle of that dish.
Very cool. Well, before we talk about the Cambrian period and maybe some of the things that y'all are finding with these incredible lab techniques that you're using, I think we have a question we'd like to pose our audience. And it's a poll that we're going to go ahead and queue up. And we just want you to take your best guess. Why do we study ancient time periods? Why does it matter that people like Thomas or Hannah are investigating these things? Is it because it can tell us a bit more about life in the past? Maybe it can help us understand life today. It's just cool. Or maybe is it a combination of all the above? So teachers, students, go ahead, maybe take a vote, post your best guess in the chat or on that poll. Why do scientists study ancient time periods? All right, take about 1 second more. And let's go ahead and close that poll. Let's see. How did everyone do? Ooh. All right, looks like a couple of folks might have said it helps us study the past, but majority are saying, I think it's all of the above. Past, present, that cool factor. So how'd they do?
They did great. Yeah, those are all amazing.
Yeah, definitely very cool to study geology and Earth's history, but it's also important that we understand where life came from and how our Earth became habitable in the way that we know it today. And also we can start to look back into geologic history and think about times of when the Earth looked a lot different than it did today, and think about ways that our Earth might change and start to look like the environment did during those times. So in the Cambrian particularly, the sea level was rising and falling really dynamically several times throughout the Cambrian, and flooding ancestral North America. So where we are today in Boise would have been completely underwater during the Cambrian. So that's really important to think about as we start to talk about sea level rise going forward into our future.
And just so we have kind of a reference of time, you know, because I think for a lot of us, especially who are not geologists, we think about time in a human sense. What does that look like for a geologist? How does geologic time kind of compare to human time? Do we have maybe a time scale we should look at?
Absolutely. So as humans, we think about time kind of in a left to right direction. You're flipping the calendar, January, February, March. Your birthday's coming up, my birthday just passed. We think about time in days and years. But in geologic time, we're thinking about time on the scale of millions of years. So the Cambrian, this period that we're super interested in today, is about 540 to 485 million years ago. So if you look at this diagram we've got pulled up on the top, that's human. That's us today with that truck and the people and the dogs. And as you start to go down through time, getting older towards the bottom, you eventually come across a Cambrian. So our Cambrian period is that third division up from the bottom in that dark blue color. And this is, geologists think about time in this vertical sense because of how rocks form. So if we think about the Grand Canyon, if we could maybe pull up a picture of the Grand Canyon, this is a really cool place that rocks, you can see that rocks are stacked right on top of each other in these really cool layers. And so the very bottom layer near the river, near the Colorado River there, is the oldest. And coming up from that, right on the skyline, that's going to be our youngest our youngest rocks in the Grand Canyon. And so that is really why we think about geologic time in this vertical sense, because of the way that rocks stack on top of each other. And because we are dealing with so much time to think about, it's instead of referring to something as millions of years, we can think about them in kind of like months on a calendar. The Cambrian period, the Devonian, we give them specific names that help geologists talk about them in a more precise, meaningful way.
Very cool. One thing I want to highlight really quick too, just for our listeners, because I know we do love dinosaurs and there's always a lot of dinosaur questions. But if you looked at that chart, you probably noticed that Cambrian came a long time before dinosaurs. So when we're talking about fossils, do we even see dinosaurs from this period?
No, we don't. So these rocks in the Cambrian period are way, way older than dinosaurs. In fact, us as humans are much closer in time to the dinosaurs than the dinosaurs were to these trilobites, Cambrian fossils. And so, yeah, this is a great way to explain like this massive amount of time compared. And so if we want to start talking about how we, analyze or think about time, when we start like, okay, how do we date these rocks? How do we know that the dinosaurs are way closer to us than they are to the trilobites? It's because scientists now and in the past have gone through and dated these rocks and be like, wow, there's so much time in this rock here, and this is dating it like this helps us better understand the Earth history and the duration of evolution.
Very cool. So if we didn't find dinosaurs in this time, what did we find in the Cambrian period?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Cambrian is kind of the advent of life as we know it today. So it's hard to kind of think about animals without heads, but heads start showing up in the Cambrian. And so along with eyes and lots of appendages like arms and like the claw on a lobster or crab, this all starts happening during the Cambrian. So some of my favorite Cambrian fossils are trilobites, and they show all of those features of having a head, which is this big rounded part on the front of this trilobite fossil, and eyes. So right here, big eyes. Trilobites are super cool because they are very unique and have changed really rapidly over time. So finding a trilobite can help you tell what time you are, what time rocks you're looking at. So, and that's because we can use these features, like trilobites have this big nose and they have kind of a forehead and funny little eyes. And my favorite part of the trilobite is his trilobut. We call this the pygidia, and features on these fossils help us determine who it is. So in the way that I can look at my friend Thomas and say, oh, he's so tall, he's got blue eyes, a beard, and brown hair. That's my pal Thomas. We can look at these trilobites and say, okay, this guy has a big nose, a strong forehead, and some frills and ornamentation. Oh, this is a Phacops trilobite. So that is one of the ways that we can use fossils to date or relatively date rocks when we can't come into a lab like this and get an exact precise date.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so these guys are here, let's say this trilobite and this trilobite, right? So through time, their nose, their butts are getting bigger, smaller, they're getting, bigger head shields, all that kind of stuff is happening through the rock record. And we can say, okay, this trilobite is older and this one is younger, more evolved. We might not necessarily know how long that process took just by looking at the trilobites. They can only give us kind of the order in that stacked column we are showing. But if we actually want to put numeric time on these trilobite evolutions, that's when we have to try to extract out these little zircon or little time capsules that help us put a duration or a rate on this evolutionary change. That's what I'm very interested in. That's what's so fascinating about the Cambrian is that we have such drastic trilobite evolution. Like life is just evolving, trying new things, eyes, arms, legs, heads. It's like, let's see what happens. It was just like this factory for really evolving the kind of the body plans that we see today. And so one of the fundamental questions is still, well, how long did that actually take? How long did that process? How protracted? Was it tens of millions of years, hundreds? We know it's got to be in the millions of years, but in evolutionary speak, that is very rapid.
Very cool. Do we also ever see things that are maybe not like the animal itself, but like evidence of an animal in fossil records? Is that something that y'all study?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. There's a branch of paleontology called ichnology, trace fossils. Anyway, trace fossils. So this right here is a little track called a Clusiana. That's what it's called. And so this is made by when a little critter like a trilobite has scurried along the surface. So this is not the animal itself, but it's evident that an animal of a certain size has crawled along the surface of the ocean. So a lot of times, yeah, you won't see the animal itself, you'll see evidence that animals have existed in the environment.
Kind of like a footprint or something.
Exactly,
right?
it's like footprints of the same. Yeah.
Very cool. One of our earlier sessions, someone wanted to know, do any of these things are they still around today? Has anything survived, or I don't know, what are they related to?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our friend, the trilobite, technically does not have any modern relatives, but it does look a lot like the horseshoe crab that you might find on the beach. Additionally, you might see some like earthworms in your yard. Worms evolved and became really, really successful during the Cambrian, and so they leave a record of their existence in rocks by burrowing around and churning up the rock and kind of almost destroying some of the like really nice layered features in the sedimentary rock. Some other things that have existed or have survived into the modern are algal mats. We call those stromatolites. If you think about, maybe you've seen a really yucky green slimy pond, the algae and slime, and that is kind of like what you might expect to be making up a coral reef, or the equivalent of a coral reef in the Cambrian.
So the Cambrian Ocean did not look a lot like the ocean does today, right?
No.
Quite different, yeah.
What were some of those differences, maybe, other than that? You said it was kind of like the critters and then just like an algae.
Yeah. So of course, the marine life would have been really, really different than anything that we know today. And we talked a lot about reefs earlier. So if we think about coral reefs that you know today, these would have looked a lot different, but they are this like massive colonial living of small creatures. So we were talking about the stromatolites or algal mats. Another component of reefs in the Cambrian were sponges. So not exactly like the sponge that you might wash your dishes with, but living animal sponges. So.
Very cool. And what about on land? I know this has been another question people have had today. So it sounds like a lot of things were living in the ocean, but were things living on the land too? Was there land in the Cambrian period?
There was land in the Cambrian period, yeah. It's probably similar land to what there is today. It just would have been, it wouldn't have looked the same. You know, North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, all those continents would have been differently shaped and oriented differently. So it wouldn't have been recognizable to us, but there would have been land. But uniquely about the Cambrian is this is before any life evolved on land. So the landscape would have been completely barren, no life, no trees, grass, flowers, nothing green. It just would have been very brown and barren. But the life in the oceans would have been teeming with life. Little critters, trilobites floating around, little like call anomalous cards, little funky little creatures that swam around, maybe eating trilobites, maybe not. A lot of worms. So a lot of life happening in the oceans, but land itself would have been completely lifeless.
Super cool. I have a question from the chat. It says, are there scales in the trilobite? Is there evidence of that? Was it a shell? What is kind of the outside of a trilobite?
Yeah, so trilobites don't actually have scales. Could I have that guy? They kind of have shells like an insect would today. These are technically insects. We call them cockroaches of the sea. What is really cool about trilobites is they have calcified eye lenses, so their eye parts fossilize really well because they're hard. So if they're also compound eyes, kind of like a fly would have, if you can imagine that. So
very cool.
Very cool. So it sounds like probably a bit more dense or like the harder material, like probably the easier it preserves, right? That makes sense since we see like dinosaur bones, but not like their skin or anything really. Oh, very cool. So those shells seem pretty important for scientists as well. Well, I would love to invite some of our friends on camera At this point, if we could get Amy Bailey's group from Crooked Timber Academy and Homeschool, if you'd like to unmute and join us on camera, we can't wait to hear your questions. Hello, welcome. So quick heads up, we are in a lab and there are a lot of machines that can't get turned off. It might be a little noisy. You're gonna have to speak nice and loud, but we can't wait to hear your questions. Okay.
What's your favorite part of your job?
Ooh, the favorite part of my job.
It's kind of a hard question.
Yeah, well, I don't know. We get to go to some really cool places and do a lot of fun field work. So Thomas and I have gotten to go in the Grand Canyon on these big giant rafts and float down the Colorado and stop off and scurry up into the side canyons and look for fossils and collect rocks. So
That's so great. Yeah, the best part is getting out in the field and finding these samples in their natural habitat.
That's so cool. That doesn't even sound like work. That's like a vacation. That's very cool. Wow. Yeah. And look at these great images. That's a good question. Awesome. Do we have any more questions from Crooked Timber Academy?
What's your least favorite part of the job?
Ooh.
Another good question.
Well, in our since we run a cleaning lab, we have to do a lot of cleaning.
Yeah.
And so cleaning is not usually anyone's favorite part. So yeah, a lot of behind the scenes cleaning and scrubbing and yeah,
When you do lab work, you have to do a lot of dishes.
yes.
Good to know. If you don't like dishes, don't work in a lab. Do we have one last question from Amy Bailey's crew at Crooked Timber Academy?
What's the weirdest thing you found, like, while looking for fossils and stuff?
Well, I think a pretty weird specimen that we have with us today is this rock with a bunch of fossils in it. The fossils in this rock are called straight cone ammonoids. So ammonoids are not alive today, but they're really similar to the nautilus that lives today. But I like to think of these guys as squids with shells. So they would have been swimming around in the ocean with their tentacles coming out of the end of their shells, capturing their prey and eating it. So pretty fun, but looks really weird. They kind of look like worms, but they're not worms.
Sneaky, fake worms. That was a great question. I guess everything's a little weird when you don't have it existing today. So very cool. If there are no more questions from Crooked Timber Academy, we could go ahead and invite another crew on. I think we did get a check-in with Barbara Flesher's crew from St. John the Baptist Catholic. If y'all would like to unmute and join us on camera, we cannot wait to hear your questions either. Hello, welcome. Awesome. Yeah, come up to the mic. We can't wait to hear.
Use your question. So if you could find out what happened Okay. If you could find out what happened above the surface of the water, how would that affect your discoveries?
Yeah, that's tricky because so in geology, most of the rocks that form fossils occur under the ocean. So the land surface is usually where it's talk about things like aren't really preserved. So it's really hard. So what we'd have to do is kind of like extrapolate from what we know on the ocean to bring us up onto land. That's a really interesting question. And it's something, I think we're still struggling with is like, how do you extrapolate a rock record to parts of the planet where we don't have that preservation? It's like having a book and half the pages are ripped out because it just wasn't preserved in the rock record. We have to use the other pages to figure out the rest of the story. So it's, yeah, that's one of the problems in geology is that we're kind of left with a partial record, and figuring out, kind of reading between the lines based on the evidence we have is, yeah, it's kind of like a common struggle in geosciences.
Puzzle with half the pieces missing. Sounds fun and very stressful. That was a good question. What other questions can we get from St. John the Baptist?
How would the plants in the ocean correlate to producing oxygen to the
Cambrian explosion as a theory?
So the question was, how do plants in the ocean make oxygen? Is that oxygen in the ocean? Yeah. So we did have those little algal mat guys, and they were photosynthesizing and making oxygen. And yeah, do you have anything?
Yeah, no, yeah, it's just those, yeah, Cambrian bacteria that kind of like break down different elements, and the byproduct is oxygen in the ocean. But the Cambrian, of course, is a very oxygen kind of poor time. We think it's like maybe 10% of the oxygen that we have today was back in the Cambrian. So, yeah, great question. Yeah, all the oxygen would have been formed from these bacteria, so we have no land plants to create oxygen like we do today.
Wow. So it sounds kind of like environments affect living things, but in turn, the living things can impact their environments. Because without those plants, we couldn't have that oxygen. A lot to think about. That was a great question. Let's go ahead and get another question from St. John the Baptist.
Could the change have been from just plain evolution?
Ooh. Could the change like from trilobites? We're talking about like the change, like an evolution of like these critters. What did that kind of look like?
Yes. So during the Cambrian, there was, well, let's go pre-Cambrian. So pre-Cambrian are the animals in our world were kind of like squishy and round and weird, and they didn't eat other animals. So at the Cambrian, we got animals who were making shells. So if we look at this rock here, this is a piece of Cambrian rock that has brachiopods in it. Brachiopods are a lot like modern day clams, which have shells. So that's exactly what's preserved here, are the shells of those brachiopods. Another thing that happens in the Cambrian is where prior to the Cambrian, all these squishy guys were living on the surface of the dirt at the bottom of the ocean. In the Cambrian, things start burrowing down and digging down and exploring that ecospace.
Yeah. We have the evolution of like actually maybe the first evidence of like predation, so like animals eating other animals rather than just animals eating algal or slime on the bottom of the ocean. So yeah.
And I think you mentioned earlier, like the trilobites, those are some of the earliest eyes we see, right? Because prior to them, a lot of things just couldn't see and they were kind of blindly.
Yeah, they might have had some
swimming.
like light detectors almost, but yeah, it's the first eye.
Very cool. What about size? Like, could we touch on like kind of evolution of size? Like how big were things at this period? I mean, when we talk about dinosaurs, millions of years later, some of them were huge. They're like the biggest things we've seen other than like whales. But what about in this period?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are trilobites tiny? How big are they?
Yeah, they kind of range quite a bit in size, but it kind of goes to the fact that we had such low oxygen levels back in the Cambrian that animals just couldn't really get big because they wouldn't have enough oxygen to do that. The most trilobites are probably, you think about the size of your thumb, maybe your thumb, fingernail, your pinky. They can be really small, almost microscopic, to this big, and some of the biggest ones up get to about maybe a meter or 3 feet long. So they actually had quite range in size, not only size, shape, morphology, they were quite a diverse species.
Very cool. That was a great question. Let's get another question from our friends at St. John the Baptist Catholic School.
Could it have been the Caribbean effect or maybe something completely different that like changed the changed?
I don't think I caught that question. Did y'all hear it? If you could read it one more time, nice and loud.
Could it have been the Cambrian effect or maybe something completely different that changed?
Like that caused change? Like, could it have been something almost unpredicted, maybe?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Interesting. What's driving this evolutionary change?
Yeah, and I think that's the the cause of the Cambrian explosion is one of those questions that is still being asked in the geologic community. We don't know. You know, in geology, unlike biology or chemistry, the experiments aren't even done for us. It was done 500 million years ago, and we are left with the dirty dishes, and we have to figure out what the experiment was. And so that is, you know, part of our job is to kind of ask these questions, and that is definitely an open-ended avenue of like, well, why did we get this big exciting change in animal life in the Cambrian?
Any question?
Yeah, solving mysteries way later. Those were amazing questions. Sounds like we have some future scientists, if not already scientists, in the crowd. At this point, I would like to invite our last crew, Chanel Swem from Morelands Elementary. If you would like to unmute and join us on camera, we would love to steal a couple questions from y'all as well. Hello. Awesome, we can-
Hello, thanks so much for this
see you.
opportunity. I'm gonna call up just a couple kids one by one, if that works.
Of course.
Can I start with Shlok?
What if you were to find like two fossils of different animals in the same rock and they were all like, and if it might have been like merged together, how would you like figure out which part goes to what animal?
Ooh, that is a great question.
Yeah.
So a lot of the times when we get trilobite fossils, they're all broken up into bits and pieces. But what's really cool about trilobites, especially and with most animals, is their bits and pieces are unique enough that we can say, oh, we think it's probably this genus, maybe this species. So we're not completely left in the dark. So that's really fortunate for us that happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a great question. I'm sure it takes a lot of practice to be able to
Yes.
identify those different parts. What's another question from Morelands Elementary?
All right.
So, where do you find most of your fossils?
Yeah, great. So, I mean, fossils can be found all over the world in any kind of sedimentary rock that's found. But where we go to find them is the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is a great place because the Colorado River has etched its way down through that strat column we saw earlier to expose rocks of Cambrian age. So what we do is we go out in the field with our fancy equipment like this hammer right here, and we go up to the cliff where we think a fossil might be. Maybe we take this hammer, we take a chisel, and we just whack big chunks off and see what we see inside. And sometimes if you take them in a rock like this, you'll crack it open, and you split it open, and you would see that an example of this, all these brachiopods right here. And there's other places where you crack them open and you would see, not of course in the Cambrian because there were no trees, but places where you'd have tree fossils. So yeah, so we go into the field with our equipment, our rock hammer and our hand lens in case they're really small. And yeah, we go there and try to find fossils. And then that gives us kind of context for, you know, what the environment was like when these fossils were formed and how old they are.
Very cool. Yeah, so it sounds like I said, a lot of work goes into recognizing what is it a fossil and is it just a rock otherwise. So great question.
Great.
What other questions do we have from Morelands Elementary?
Okay.
Right here.
Okay. My question is, what would be like one fossil that you would really want to find?
Maybe one they haven't found yet.
One fossil that we'd really like to find. I'm pretty interested in the oldest trilobite. I would really love to find one of those.
Yeah, and yeah, the oldest trilobite, that would be great. I'd also love to find that trilobite and date it to figure out exactly how old it is. One of the places we're thinking about doing that is in Eastern California. It supposedly has some of the oldest known trilobites in the world. So we're lucky. Hannah and I would be awesome. We'd love to go down there and collect these rocks and then bring them here and figure out how old they actually are. Yeah, that would be a great one.
Someday find. Fingers crossed. Maybe one of our friends in the audience will find it and they can report back to you. That would be awesome. Let's get at least one more question from Morelands Elementary.
Okay.
What is the rarest fossil you've ever found?
Rarest. Rarest. Hmm.
Oh, you know what? You remember when we went to Arizona and found sea anemone fossils? Wasn't that awesome?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's really, we were talking about hard parts and how those are easier to fossilize. But if you think about a sea anemone, that's like squishy and weird. But
Yeah.
Thomas and I found fossilized sea anemones, and they just look like little blueberries sticking up off the surface of a rock.
Yeah, exactly. Usually with animals, all we find are the hard bits, like the shells or the bones. But sometimes what's really interesting is to find still the soft parts still preserved is quite unique. Those are very rare.
So something like an octopus would be, anything, a jellyfish, an octopus, anything squishy, you
Yeah.
might not find in the fossil record. But it doesn't mean they didn't exist, right?
Exactly. And there are those rare occasions where the conditions just perfect that you get a fossilized octopus. Yeah.
That is pretty wild.
Great question.
Do we have any last questions from Morelands Elementary?
All right, one more. Thank you.
How long do fossils take to find and study?
Oh,
Yeah.
well, these fossils, we had to wait 540 million years to study, so that's a long time. But it takes however long it takes to get to the rocks. So in the case of the Grand Canyon, you have to plan a big river trip and float down the river, or in some of my work, you have to hike miles in and hike up these big mountains to find those rocks that have the fossils, and then you take them home and you get the fossil out of the rock or prepare it so that you can see all the details and then look at it under the microscope, and that's when the work begins, right?
Yeah, one really cool way some people study fossils is that you take the rock and you heat it up over basically a blowtorch. You get it really hot, then you throw it in ice cold water, and the rock breaks into a million pieces. But it breaks around the fossils because there's already those pre-existing kind of fractures there in the rock. So that's one kind of prep way you take these rocks, get the fossils out of the rock themselves.
Okay, that's very cool. Did not know that was a thing. Way cooler than a hammer, I guess. We have a couple more of those superlative questions. Largest fossil. What is the largest fossil either of you have found? Or seen, I guess, even.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we were talking about dinosaur monument in Vernal, Utah. I think those are some of the biggest dinosaur fossils that I've seen. So multi-story size.
I agree.
What about the trilobites? I mean, how big were they? If we found a large one of those, how big could that be?
Yeah, the largest.
I think the biggest one I've seen in a display case was maybe this big around.
Yeah.
But yeah, not out in the field. Yeah, for the most part, they're pretty small. The large ones are pretty rare.
Very cool. As far as looking at what do we do with our fossils? Do y'all send these fossils to museums? Are they just in labs? What do we do with them?
Yeah, so a lot of the fossils that get studied end up in repositories in museums. So
very cool. Here's another question from the chat. Why do trilobites need their shells? So why do critters, what was the benefit of having shells in this period?
I would protect them from their environment, to protect them from their predators. But also a lot of times, trilobites throughout their life would have many shells that they would discard or molt. Kind of like the idea of a crab or crustacean, they would molt their shell. So that's why there's so many of them fossils, is that one trilobite could form many different fossils throughout its lifetime as it molts these shells that get preserved in the rock record. That's why there's just so many of them during the time period.
yeah, didn't you mention earlier that other animals are eating each other at this time?
Yeah,
So that would be pretty handy to have a shell.
Nice. Could there be any downsides to having a shell?
I think, we've got that artistic rendition pulled up in here, and there's a flipped over trilobite in it, and his legs are down on the left. I think that would be a pretty big disadvantage, to be like a turtle stuck on your back with all your legs poking out. But it's also kind of heavy to have a shell, and it takes a lot of energy to make that shell. So, yeah.
Nice. So maybe, if you're using so much energy to make your body bigger or stronger, or with a shell, you're probably having to eat a lot more. And interesting. Or maybe eating other living things.
Right?
So
Yeah.
wild. That's very cool. So here's a question about finding things, and we'll kind of make this one of our last ones. If we're going into the field and we're looking at fossils and all that, what are some of the strategies you use to like identify or classify kind of what you're looking at?
Okay, yeah, I think first you want to know if you look at the right type of rock to find fossils. So there are kind of, as geologists, we kind of categorize rocks into three types. There's igneous rock, think of like lava and magma crystallizing into a rock. You have sedimentary rocks. These are rocks that form at the Earth's surface as other rocks erode and they deposit into the oceans or rivers or lakes. And then the third type are rocks that are, you take those rocks and you bury them deep down in the earth and you squish them and heat them and bake them and they transform them into a third rock type. But fossils only occur in the middle type, the sedimentary rock type. So if you're going out in the field to look for fossils, you got to make sure you're looking at the right type. And also make sure you're looking at rocks of the appropriate right age. There's been so much studying of rock and their approximate ages throughout the last 100 years that you can usually approximately know what age the rock you're looking at. So you want to go for trilobites, you're not going to go for rocks that are Jurassic or dinosaur age. You want to know that you're looking in the right type of rock to find trilobites. And then once you go there, we're going to like take our hammer and chisel, we're going to split open these thin layers of rock to see if we can see the fossils inside.
Very cool. Are there any things that you use in the field to identify rocks or fossils, Sienna?
Yeah. One of the geologist tool is a hand lens, and these are basically magnifying glasses that we can take out into the field that give us a closer look at our rocks. And so we just hold these up to our eye and look at the rock and observe all the features in it. And one really, really fun secret geologist tool is we like to lick rocks. So one of the special occasions you might lick rock is if you think it's salt. So your table salt is actually a mineral that you can identify by licking it, and that's a pretty dead giveaway. But in our sedimentary rocks, which are made up of grains or particles of other rocks, what's really important to know is the size of the grain. And so when maybe we can't really tell the size by looking or feeling it with our fingers, we will lick the rock to see what the grain size is.
Sometimes you can take a little bite and chew on it and see how gritty it is. The grittier it is, right, the larger the crystals are that make up that rock.
No way.
Yes.
That is amazing. What a dedicated pair. Well, on that note, I know, people I'm sure have more questions in the chat and audience, and I know I always have questions. But we are kind of running out of time. So is there anything you would like to leave our friends on as far as encouraging them to become scientists or continue pursuing these amazing questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just say that, geology is a great science. There's more things about the earth that we don't know than we do know. So I would just say, follow your curiosity, whether you're interested in these Cambrian stuff we've been talking about, or maybe stuff that's even older before life formed. If you're interested in dinosaurs, just go out there and look for rocks, pick up rocks. You might find a fossil or a mineral that we as scientists don't even know existed yet. And maybe that'll tell us about some process that we maybe thought happened, or maybe we hadn't even thought of yet as happening. So yeah, just follow your curiosity and see where it takes you, and you never know what you might find.
Yeah, you guys have been asking a lot of really great questions today. And that's what we do, is we ask questions of the earth and the earth's history. And so keep asking questions, keep being curious, and explore science around you.
When you figure out some of those answers that we couldn't answer, please report back because we want to know. So on that note, thank you so much, everyone who posted questions in the chat or threw questions at us on camera. We are just so appreciative that you gave us your time and your energy and your curiosity. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, James. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Asa. All of our crew who you can't see because they're off camera, but making this amazing program happen. Thank you, of course, Hannah. Thank you, Thomas, for sharing with us today. If you enjoyed today's program, we would love to see you again. We have another couple programs coming up soon in February, again later this month on the 22nd. we're going to Cheyenne, Wyoming to visit a supercomputing center where we get to predict weather the size of hurricanes, which is pretty wild. Then in March on the 9th, we'll be going to an ice core facility to talk more about ancient time, but instead of using rocks, we're using really, really old ice. So a lot of really cool things coming down the pike. So thank you again. If you are on camera and you want to unmute, we can't wait to hear your voices and say goodbye to you. Otherwise, thank you again. This was so fun. We can't wait to see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
And